In the frozen heart of a crumbling empire, the year 1917 began not with triumphant marches, but with the hollow rattle of empty grain carts, and the distant murmur of discontented crowds. Petrograd, once a glittering capital of Tsarist splendor, now shivered under a blanket of relentless snow, as political crises that had simmered for decades suddenly boiled over into open chaos. The vast Russian Empire, stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, stood as a colossus built on autocracy, orthodoxy, and an unyielding social hierarchy. Yet beneath its gilded domes and military parades lay fractures that no amount of imperial decree could mend. Factories belched smoke into gray skies, while peasants toiled in fields that yielded less each season, their labor feeding a war machine that devoured sons and resources alike. No one yet whispered the word collapse, but the air itself carried the scent of impending rupture, a silent warning woven into the fabric of daily existence, where bread lines stretched for blocks, and whispers of reform turned into shouts of defiance. For centuries, the Romanov dynasty had ruled with iron conviction, their authority rooted in divine right and reinforced by a sprawling bureaucracy that reached into every village and garrison. Daily life before the Great Unraveling moved to the rhythm of seasonal harvests and orthodox rituals, where noble families hosted lavish balls in St. Petersburg palaces, while serfs, recently emancipated yet still bound by debt and custom, scratched meager existences from unforgiving soil. Workers in the growing industrial centers endured 12-hour shifts amid the clang of machinery and the acrid bite of coal dust. Their families huddled in cramped tenements where tuberculosis claimed lives as readily as the winter cold. Soldiers on the Eastern Front, thrust into the meat grinder of the First World War, wrote letters home describing endless artillery barrages and supply lines that failed to deliver even basic rations. This was the empire's surface calm, a veneer of routine masking the rot beneath. Land shortages, ethnic tensions among Poles, Ukrainians and others, and an aristocracy increasingly detached from the realities of a modernizing world. The Tsar and his court projected strength through ceremonial displays, but the empire's vastness had become its greatest weakness. A territory too immense to govern effectively amid the pressures of total war. Yet the invisible warning signs had been accumulating like storm clouds on the horizon, unnoticed or willfully ignored by those in power. Economic strain from the war effort led to skyrocketing inflation, with the ruble losing value almost daily as printing presses struggled to keep pace with mounting debts. Corruption festered within the government, where ministers appointed through favoritism rather than competence mismanaged resources, leaving troops without ammunition and civilians without food. Intellectuals and reformers, long advocating for constitutional changes, found their voices amplified in underground pamphlets and secret meetings, while the Duma, Russia's fledgling parliament, clashed repeatedly with the autocrat over war policies and domestic reforms. Strikes in the factories of Petrograd and Moscow grew more frequent, workers laying down tools not just for better wages, but as acts of political protest against a system that seemed deaf to their suffering. Rural unrest simmered as rumors spread of hoarded grain and profiteering landlords. These were not yet revolutionary sparks, but quiet tremors. Political crises born from unaddressed grievances, administrative paralysis, and the widening gulf between the rulers and the ruled. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly, in the incremental failures of governance that eroded trust, one decree at a time. As tensions rose, the instability became impossible to conceal, manifesting in the streets and the corridors of power alike. The provisional attempts at reform after years of Tsarist intransigence only highlighted the depth of the divide. Nicholas II, isolated in his military headquarters, clung to notions of personal rule even as battlefield defeats mounted and supply shortages triggered widespread famine fears. Political factions within the Duma, liberals, socialists, and conservatives, fractured along ideological lines, their debates descending into bitter recriminations while the war continued its relentless drain on manpower and morale. In the cities, food riots erupted sporadically, women and children braving the bitter cold to demand bread that never arrived, their voices joining the growing chorus of soldiers' wives and factory hands. The secret police reported increasing desertions from the front, men slipping away not from cowardice, but from a profound sense that the empire no longer deserved their sacrifice. International pressures compounded the crisis, with allies demanding more offensives, while domestic radicals, inspired by Marxist ideas circulating among exiles and intellectuals, organized workers' councils known as Soviets. The system groaned under the weight of these converging forces, key decisions delayed or botched, such as the Tsar's refusal to share power meaningfully, or the military's ill-fated campaigns that accelerated the slide toward disorder. By this point, the political crises had evolved from manageable disputes into an existential threat, yet the elite still believed the old order could endure through sheer force of tradition. The moment the system began to fail arrived with shocking swiftness in February 1917, when a seemingly ordinary bread shortage in Petrograd ignited a firestorm that would consume the empire. Women protesting ration cuts were joined by striking workers, their demonstrations swelling into massive crowds that filled the avenues, defying Cossack charges and police barricades. Soldiers, ordered to fire on their own people, instead laid down arms and joined the uprising, their mutiny marking the irreversible fracture in the chain of command. The Tsar, hundreds of miles away, received fragmented reports and issued commands that arrived too late or were simply ignored. Within days, the Duma formed a provisional government amid the chaos, while Soviets of workers and soldiers asserted parallel authority in the streets and barracks. Nicholas II, facing total loss of support from generals and ministers alike, abdicated the throne, ending over 3 centuries of Romanov rule in a single stunned moment of political rupture. What had been simmering political crises exploded into open revolution, not through grand battles, but through the quiet collapse of loyalty and the sudden realization that the emperor wore no clothes. The old institutions crumbled almost overnight, leaving a power vacuum that no single faction could immediately fill. In the wake of this failure, human consequences unfolded with brutal clarity across the vast empire. Cities descended into disorder as food distribution collapsed entirely, leading to widespread hunger and opportunistic violence. Families that once maintained fragile routines now scavenged for survival, their daily lives punctuated by the sounds of distant gunfire and the sight of looted shops. Soldiers streamed homeward in disorganized waves, bringing tales of betrayal and arming themselves with whatever weapons they could seize. Ethnic minorities, long suppressed, asserted claims to autonomy, further fragmenting the imperial territory. The provisional government, caught between liberal ideals and the radical demands of the Soviets, struggled to maintain order while continuing the disastrous war. Inflation spiraled out of control, savings evaporated, and black markets thrived amid official paralysis. Peasants seized land from estates, sometimes with bloodshed, as centuries of resentment found violent release. Fear became a constant companion, the fear of starvation, of arrest, of the unknown future, replacing the predictable hardships of the past. Social breakdown was not abstract. It was felt in the empty markets, the overcrowded hospitals, and the growing bands of desperate refugees clogging the roads. The political crises had dismantled the old order, but in its place arose uncertainty and competing visions that promised salvation, yet delivered further turmoil. The long-term historical impact of these events reshaped not only Russia, but the entire trajectory of the 20th century. The provisional government's weakness paved the way for the Bolshevik seizure of power in October, led by Lenin and his disciplined revolutionaries, who promised peace, land, and bread to a war-weary populace. What began as a political crisis evolved into civil war, foreign intervention, and the birth of the Soviet Union, a new empire built on ideological foundations that would challenge global powers for decades. The collapse demonstrated how internal divisions, exacerbated by external war, could unravel even the mightiest autocracies, inspiring revolutionaries and reformers worldwide, while terrifying established orders. Economic experiments, purges, and industrialization followed in the decades ahead, but the initial rupture left scars visible in the redrawn maps of Europe and the ideological battles of the Cold War. Historians would later trace the roots of modern totalitarianism and the redrawing of alliances back to these chaotic months, where the failure of one political system birthed another, amid rivers of blood and mountains of shattered expectations. The empire's fall underscored a timeless truth. When political legitimacy evaporates, Chaos fills the void with unpredictable consequences that echo across generations. Yet even as the dust of revolution settled into the structures of a new regime, the haunting echoes of that collapse lingered in the collective memory of a nation and the world. The streets that once rang with imperial anthems now carried the songs of internationalism, but beneath them lay the silence of lost traditions and uncounted lives extinguished in the upheaval. What if wiser decisions had been made earlier? What if the warnings embedded in strikes and shortages had prompted genuine reform rather than repression? These questions haunt any study of such moments, reminding us that collapses are rarely inevitable, but often the result of accumulated blindness to the fragile threads holding society together. In the end, the political crises that led to chaos in 1917 serve as a somber mirror for any era, reflecting how power, when divorced from the realities of those it governs, invites its own destruction. The empire did not vanish in a single cataclysm, but dissolved through a procession of missteps, each one widening the cracks until the entire edifice gave way. And in that quiet aftermath, the lesson endures. Stability is never guaranteed, and the seeds of rupture are often sown long before the first visible tremors shake the ground.